They had overnighted on the night known as Samhain, the day before the church day of remembrance for all of its saints. Rathlin Island had been quiet, almost too quiet. Its huge cliffs rising out of the grey water as if the sea itself had solidifed into the granite outcrops that loomed over the coracles that had transported them over the sea from Iona. Fergus and Finoli were subdued, their meal had been taken with the monks, who clearly had no truck with their will to eat supper in silence. Constantine had been put on watch of boats, as Domhnall trod a lonely vigil around the cliffs, as if enduring the night's bitter cold and wind would cleanse his soul of his sin. The next morning, as they sailed southwest, following Ulster's north coast to find the channel that would lead them to the Foyle estuary, Osric asked the pilot of their coracle what Savin was. A night for the fairy folk, and the dead, was all he would share. So, Osric wrapped herself up in her blanket, staring down at the sea. Where Northumbria faced east, with the land crowded behind the sea, here in the rich seas of Ulster the land spread out, dark green and lush, large horizons where the sea, if not always in view, suggested its presence, and could be taken in at a glance. They were heading to the monastery at Doia Comesill, on the west bank of the Foyle. Comesill had lived there, before launching for Rathlin, and then to Iona, the monks at Rathlin had told them. Fog settled as they entered the Foyle estuary, making Osric's hair wet. As the coracle pilots skimmed their oars up the river, Osric noticed people on the banks, watching them pass. They were walking towards a large wooden building which loomed around a bend. The monastery, she supposed. And, it was the Day of All Saints. Many services would be read. They drew close to the bank of the river, directly outside the monastery. The procession of people were indeed entering the monastery. They joined them, crowding in, their swords and bringing a chattering attention as they shouldered their way through. The weak sun was high in the sky as they left, Fergus handing Osric a skin which contained a little ale, which he hurried off her as a monk passed their row. "Come," Domhnall said, his voice flat and serious, waving them over. On the bank where they had landed a group of men stood. Between them a woman, hair black, parted in two and plaited, one plait down each side of her head, a white cloth pinned to her head. On her left was a man. Osric stared, and could not take her eyes from him. The man's shoulders began where the warriors' heads finished. His hair, red as the evening sun, flowed over his shoulders as a dark golden waterfall, a moustache on each side of his nostril of the same orange hair, drooped down to where his chin might have been if a beard did not cascade to his chest. He was twice as broad as the woman, and Finliarth's voice boomed around as he welcomed Domhnall and Constantine to their home. "We have stopped Norse expansion on the coast," Finliarth boasted, as they feasted that night in their fortress adjacent the monastery, surrounded by oak trees on three sides. "Those we baptize, those who blend their lives with ours we pay to keep more Norse from invading. Then, they have as much of an interest in keeping more Norse from the land as we do." Osric ate a piece of roasted fish in silence as she listened to the voices around her. 6 months learning Gaelic at Dunnottar and the voices here were indecipherable. How was it Constantine and Domhnall could understand his kin? Was it, to them, slight changes in speech, like when the East Angles would visit, or the West Saxons or the Sentish traders? Enough of a difference, but not too much? Domhnall's troubles had, if not left him, been put aside, as he conversed easily with the men of Finliarth's court, accepting meat, sharing wine. She watched as Domhnall passed over the books entrusted to him to Finliarth, who laughed in pleasure at the pages. The woman, who turned out to be Malmuia, Constantine and Domhnall's aunt, murmured, pleased. "He says that while he was the Lord proclaimed as Lord of Tara at the festival of the Uineal when his father died," Fergus explained, passing Osric more fish. "Tara is in Flansin's territory, of the southern Uineal. He is the strongest of Zalais, yet is the High King of Ireland." Osric thought this over, then wrinkled her eyes as she considered it again. To think she had once thought Anglo and Saxon politics was complicated, and then Welsh. Then, she had gone to Pitland and met its Gaelish king. But, Irish kingship? She may never understand it. And now Domhnall is telling the king about the king, the Pictish king's opinion as to where the Norse go, to Dulreader's Isles or Highlands, to Strathclyde's inlets, to Pitland's fertile coastlines. Osric looked at Fergus, frowning. Not the best start in diplomacy to the family who have just begun to shelter you, she muttered, grinning. The warrior laughed. She looked across to the table at which Constantine sat. In the candlelight, he looked older, somehow, as Findlay addressed him, no trace of a scowl or sullenness, only a dignified smile and polite conversation. He did not look at her. Beside him, Osric noticed, a place was set and food served to an empty chair. It was how, Osric knew, it was meant to be. May you tell me of the Shay, and the festival of Savin? So, as Fergus unpacked the whole gamut of Gaelic superstition, of feasting, and the fire, brought in a pot to the very centre of the hall, of the foods offered to the fire fresh, harvested wheat and grain, of the dancing which would, no doubt, begin once the food was cleared. And, no doubt, she, Osric, would be helping with that. What are you to do here, in the land of the Irish? She asked herself. Fergus soon finished discussing the spirits passing between world and the feast of the dead, and now Cinche ears had begun a story. But Osric was not listening, for the answer came flying back to her. You gave your answer, Osric of Northumbria, to Domhnall MacAlpin. 88,888,888. 31st of October 899. A long time ago, Constantine's father, MacAlpin, had said that it was the choices one made, personal, quiet choices that made the difference. You'd had called life's choices fate, or the Norns, laughing as they wove destruction into men's lives. To Osric, it was, and could only be God, moving in a way no man could strategize. It was telling the court, in the year Osric had come, around a fire at the beginning of harvest, about St. Patrick of Cumbraland, and the choice he made to leave his master to whom he had been sold as a slave. He had walked 200 miles back to the coast, asked for passage with non-Christians. When they refused, for he had no money, he immediately prayed to God for guidance. The heathen had then turned and offered Patrick passage. The heathen expected a gesture from Patrick to mark his generosity, a heathen practice. But Patrick said that his faith could not allow this, and he refused. What do you suppose the heathens did when Patrick snubbed their tradition? The children were eager to answer, raising hands and shouting, killed him. And, drowned him. But, of course, we know that Patrick returned to Cumbraland, to his family, and them felt God telling him to go back to Ireland, to reveal God's grace to the heathen. They had taken him anyway. King had continued, to the disappointment of some of the children, and his teaching had caused a stone to be plunged into the souls of the Irish believers, and its ripples radiated out far and wide, to Iona, to Caldes, to Lindisfarne and to Durham, to Whitby and Lincoln and Lichfield. One big circle of faith from one small stone of man. Yes, Osric had thought at the time, and a few centuries later, another man had made a decision, a choice. King Oswy, her ancestor, adhered to the Irish Church, his wife, a Roman Church adherent. Where Oswy celebrated Easter, and feasted and required marital relations with his wife, Eanfled still fasted. She remembered this story as child and had asked Father Bowker why he had not made humans less willful, if what he wanted was for men to follow his word. Bowker had laughed, and said he had no answer to this. Maybe, the struggle to find him was part of faith. Yet, the Roman Church, far from melding with the heathen beliefs as the Irish had done, merely imposed rules and forbiddances. And heathen practices survived. On the night she had arrived back to Dunnottar, Elasade had shown Osric her room, not the little poky one shared by many servants off the kitchens, but the one near Constantine. The nurseries and royal children's rooms were not far, and that was where Edra would go. But not that night, for there was no time to find a wet nurse. So Osric nursed the little flame-kissed baby through the night, awoken by her little mewlings, and screams, like cows lowing, around the courtyard. The wind, her sensible mind forced her to think as Edra let go the remains of the previous meal, leaving Osric to call for linens. She is beautiful, Constantine had fussed, so unlike himself, as he oversaw the baby emptied from Osrith's arms and into the arms of the now very elderly Elisade. The wet nurse who tended the royal infants, Malcolm, Domhnall's son, and in Dulf, Constantine's. "Where is the king?" Osrith asked Constantine. And she was taken, as the household began to prepare for the night's feast, with fire and food and dancing. Seined led her across the courtyard as the food for the feast was being arranged. It came as a shock to Osrith as she pushed open the oak door of the king's bedchamber, as the moanings and cries of the night before became obvious and apparent. "He does not know who he is any longer," Seined murmured gently, as Osrith looked on the face of the man she held in the very highest regard and esteem. Old and frail, his once thick, black hair fell upon his pillow, tangled, with clumps missing. His once proud and firm face, which had seen off countless of Norse and, at a turn, comforted his petulant cousin, was now sunken in a mass of lines and lumps. His eyes were closed. Osrith sat beside him, as softly as she could, and he did not seem to notice, nor even when she had moved her own hand and put it across his, which were clasped together, as if in prayer. Osrith felt her heart lurch. What had happened to this once noble and able man? "Madness," Seined said, putting his hand to her shoulder. "After his son was born, after Mary died." Osrith knew as much. Constantine said his cousin had gone mad and had not been able to rule for a year or more. On the night of his wife's death he had been found wandering around the castle wearing nothing before screaming into the stables. After Malcolm's birth and Mary's death, his decline had been swift. Domhnall had once told her that she fought like a Gaelish warrior. No thought occurred to her ever to flee, but to run headlong into a fight. But he had been wrong. Osrith had fled, 10 years ago, refusing to trust Domhnall when asked her to, as words swirled down utter of Edra Uhtred's daughter being found. She had fled many times in battle and, 3 nights before, she had fled Wessex, a motherless child in her arms. Yet, it was true she had fled here, to Dunnottar, a place she could call her home. A place where she had become a warrior, more or less, with the consent of a king. Osrith had been about to get up, to leave the king when she found that he was holding her hands, one in each, his eyes open, bright and sharp. "Osrith," he managed, through parched lips. "Thammy ... cure ... agam." His words tailed off. Osrith felt her heart hammer in her chest. She knew what he had said, even now, even though mad. Cure hien ... that was what he called his warriors. "Your sword," King Domhnall had demanded of her. She looked into his eyes, her heart crushed by this Gaelish warrior, who had fought beside her on the battlefield, now brought so low. "Me chanal me agam to lead ... I don't have it anymore." The king pulled himself, with difficulty, up the bed, and leaned towards her, his eyes, full knowing of where he was, and who Osrith was. "Then, warrior, you must fetch it back." Choices had brought Domhnall so low, Osrith knew. Had made a choice, to take her into the royal house and life. God had brought her to that moment. Domhnall had made the choice to be loyal to his line of the House Alpin, and produce heirs instead of remaining unmarried. Want of pleasing God had caused Domhnall to believe he was lacking in his faith for humping men. Yet his choice had brought the Pictish and Gaelish crowns together. As far away as Wessex, he was named Domhnall, King of Alba. Yet, the beliefs of long ago still lingered, and that night, as Osrith went to hold Edra, and fuss over the girl, the castle was barred so no one, not even a guard, not even a cat could get out. Not even a sahib could get in. On the morning of the day of All Saints Leodies, one of the young household guards had found King Domhnall, naked, sword in hand, face down in the courtyard. Osrith had seen him rush over as she had got up early to wash, and she, too, had knelt beside her lord. He had been locked in, Osrith knew. The maids and the butler had been fiercely interrogated. Yet, from a locked room and a barred castle, the king of the Picts and the Gaels had stumbled down the stairs, waved his sword and fell down, a blow to his temple from the stones in the courtyard, ending his life. Now, the world seemed like a much darker place. Mothai Hiena She had whispered, as another guard, Connor, had come to help. But his ears would never convey her filial love for him to his brain. So she prayed to God, silently, as Saenid led her away, and in the still of the morning, when all the sight had gone, Osrith did the most un-Osrith-like thing, something she had only ever done once before. She cried.